think there were not many people who understood just how broad his interests were and how supportive he was of an astonishingly wide range of organisations.
The most important royal transitions are rarely announced with trumpets. They begin with a quiet change in who receives the papers, who approves the schedule, and whose judgment is sought first. Now, reports surrounding King Charles III and Prince William have raised one question the palace has not fully answered. Has control of the crown already begun to move? According to claims circulating among royal commentators, Charles has begun allowing Prince William, the Prince of Wales, to assume a far greater role in the daily direction of the monarchy. Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed that the king has formally surrendered operational control, and Charles remains the sovereign. Yet even the suggestion of such a transfer would represent far more than an ordinary delegation of duties. It would mean that the future king was no longer preparing at the edge of power. He was beginning to stand inside it. For William, that distinction would carry enormous weight. A sudden transfer of influence would remove the comfort of distance. Decisions once discussed as part of the future could begin arriving as immediate questions requiring his approval. Those are not ceremonial questions. They shape how the monarchy is seen, and whether the royal household appears united or uncertain. But the figure drawing the greatest attention is not William. It is Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, and occupies an unusual place within the House of Windsor. She is the king's sister, one of the family's most consistent working members, and a royal known for speaking with a directness palace language often avoids. That is why reports that she has finally broken her silence have created such interest. The phrase may be dramatic, and no verified public statement has confirmed the private claims surrounding it. If Charles were truly placing greater operational responsibility in William's hands, the Princess Royal could be best placed to judge whether the arrangement represented sensible preparation or a warning that pressure inside the monarchy had become more serious than the public realized. Her loyalty would not be simple. As a sister, she might wish to protect Charles from appearing diminished. As an aunt, she would understand the burden being placed upon William. As a senior royal, she would also recognize that uncertainty at the top can spread quickly through every office connected to the crown. And defending her brother, supporting her nephew, or protecting the monarchy from hesitation. Perhaps she was trying to do all three. Royal authority is not expressed only through crowns, balconies, or state ceremonies. Much of it moves quietly through briefing papers, official diaries, appointments, patronages, and access to the sovereign's attention. The person who organizes those decisions may not legally wear the crown, but can still shape its direction. If William has been given increased influence over that machinery, then the balance inside the palace may already be changing before any formal constitutional change occurs. Charles would remain the monarch, carrying the legal and symbolic authority of the sovereign. Yet the Prince of Wales could increasingly become the figure whose judgment determines how that authority is translated into daily action. One man would embody the reign, while another began directing more of its momentum. At first glance, such an arrangement could appear practical. The king could concentrate on selected state responsibilities, while William absorbed more strategic and organizational work. It might allow the monarchy to demonstrate continuity without forcing an abrupt change. But practical arrangements often create emotional consequences. For Charles, delegation could bring relief while reminding him that the institution is learning to function through his successor. For William, new authority could create confidence, but also guilt. Every effective decision might strengthen his position while making his father appear less central. For Queen Camilla, the change could raise a different question. If decisions that once reached Charles directly were now reviewed through William's household, would that improve coordination or quietly reduce her influence within the royal structure? There is no confirmed evidence of a dispute, and claims of internal resistance remain speculative. Still, the possibility shows why a transfer of responsibility could affect relationships far beyond father and son. Catherine, Princess of Wales, would also feel the consequences. Any expansion of William's role would bring greater expectations for her. She would be expected to project stability and help ensure that change did not appear like ambition. The monarchy would face a familiar contradiction. It must show readiness without appearing eager, and it must change without making the present reign look obsolete. This may be where Anne's reported intervention becomes most significant. Some observers believe she would insist that any transfer be clear enough to prevent competing instructions, but respectful enough to preserve the king's dignity. She would know that divided authority can invite confusion, while a transfer handled without compassion can leave lasting family wounds. Yet clarity itself could be painful. The moment staff began treating William's decisions as final, the palace would feel different. Long-standing advisors might wonder whether their influence was ending. Family members could begin calculating how their roles would change. Even routine scheduling decisions might become evidence that the center of gravity had moved. And if Anne truly chose this moment to speak, perhaps her concern was not that William had received too much authority. Perhaps it was that Charles had allowed the change to happen without preparing the family for what it would mean. Because handing control to an heir is one thing. Asking a son to exercise that control over the people closest to his father is something far more difficult. That was the first layer of the conflict. But it still did not explain why this reported transfer appeared to happen now, or what may have convinced Charles that the old arrangement could no longer continue. To understand that, we have to look at the earlier signs of strain inside the royal household, and at the moment when hesitation reportedly became more dangerous than change. The signs of strain may have appeared long before any formal transfer was discussed, not in a dramatic declaration, but in the quieter pattern that often reveals more than an announcement. Delayed decisions, overlapping instructions, advisors waiting for clarity, and senior royals stepping into gaps that were never meant to remain open. According to royal commentators, the royal household depends upon precision. Ceremonial order, state briefings, and public messaging may look separate, but each relies upon a clear chain of authority. When that chain becomes uncertain, confusion at the center can quickly become visible at the edges. Reports have suggested that William was already taking on greater responsibility where speed and consistency mattered. It remains unconfirmed whether this involved any formal transfer, but observers have noted a pattern in which the Prince of Wales increasingly appeared not only as a supporting figure, but as the person expected to represent continuity when the palace faced pressure. To some advisors, that would have been reassuring. To others, it may have felt like a new order arriving before the existing one had fully concluded. Royal power often changes through habit before it changes through law. Staff begins seeking the same person's judgment. Difficult questions are redirected toward the figure most likely to answer. A temporary solution becomes routine. Before anyone openly acknowledges what has happened, the institution has already altered its behavior. Was William simply helping his father, or had the palace begun relying upon him in a way that made a transfer almost inevitable? If reports are accurate, one of the most sensitive pressures involved competing advice from different parts of the royal structure. The king's household, the office supporting William and Catherine, and the interests surrounding Camilla would each have legitimate concerns. Yet those concerns would not always produce compatible instructions. A major engagement could involve precedence, security, symbolism, and family sensitivity. One office might favor tradition, another modern public expectations, and a third the dignity of a senior royal whose position appeared to be changing. When no one could determine whose recommendation carried final weight, the monarchy risked appearing hesitant precisely when it needed to look assured. This is where Anne's perspective may have become decisive. The Princess Royal has spent much of her public life working without demanding that attention follow her. That distance from the competition surrounding the future court may have allowed her to recognize the deeper danger. It was not simply that Charles and William might disagree. It was that competing offices could begin using the uncertainty between them. Some advisors might continue appealing to the king whenever William's answer was inconvenient. Others could behave as though Charles had already withdrawn. Family members might choose whichever channel supported their preferred outcome. In time, the palace could develop two centers of decision-making, each claiming loyalty to the same crown. Buckingham Palace has not confirmed that such a division occurred, yet the possibility explains why a practical transfer might suddenly become urgent. Once authority becomes negotiable, every unresolved question invites someone else to shape the answer. For Charles, that may have created a painful contradiction. Delegating more responsibility could protect the institution from delay, but every successful intervention by his son would also demonstrate how effectively the system could function without waiting for him. Relief and loss could arrive together. The king may have recognized William's readiness while still struggling with what it meant for his own reign. A father could feel pride in the future king's confidence, while the monarch in him understood that confidence as evidence of approaching change. William would face the opposite pressure. He might know that acting decisively protected his father from embarrassment, yet fear that each decision made in Charles's place pushed the sovereign further from the center. This was not simply a contest for influence. It was a conflict between two forms of loyalty. Should the son protect the father by carrying more of the burden, even if doing so makes the father appear less necessary? Or should he step back to preserve the king's authority, even when hesitation could expose the monarchy to greater risk? Catherine could help William distinguish restraint from indecision, while Camilla might face a system increasingly organized around the heir rather than direct access to the king. Even ordinary decisions could then acquire a family meaning they were never intended to carry. A sudden transfer would challenge the monarchy's tradition of presenting internal adaptation as seamless continuity. It would require the palace to admit, directly or indirectly, that the existing arrangement no longer met the moment. Was this an orderly modernization, or a response to pressures that had already gone too far? Some royal watchers believe the answer may lie in a particular episode when conflicting instructions reportedly threatened to disrupt an important engagement. Details remain unverified, and no official account has identified one event as the cause. Yet such a moment would fit the wider pattern. Staff waiting, Charles confronting competing demands, and William intervening before uncertainty became visible. If that happened, the success of the intervention could have mattered more than the original problem. Advisors would have seen who restored order. William would have discovered that others were prepared to follow his judgment. Charles would have been confronted with evidence that the monarchy's operational center was shifting in real time. And, watching as both sister and senior royal, may have understood the cost immediately. The question was no longer whether William could lead. It was whether the family could accept what his leadership revealed. Because once the household began functioning more smoothly through the heir, returning to the previous arrangement might have created greater instability than allowing the change to continue. And that is where the story moved beyond delegation into something far more sensitive. The transfer may not have begun as a plan to reduce Charles's role. It may have begun with one decision made under pressure, and with the unsettling discovery that, when the moment demanded clarity, the entire palace already knew whose voice it was prepared to follow. That recognition may have been the moment when an informal pattern became impossible to ignore. If senior officials were already turning toward William whenever clarity was needed, then Charles faced a choice far more difficult than simply delegating additional engagements. He had to decide whether to resist the shift or give it a structure before uncertainty began weakening the crown. The distinction between influence and authority is especially important within a monarchy. An heir may offer advice, represent the sovereign, and undertake major duties without possessing the power to direct the institution. Yet once advisors begin treating that heir's judgment as the safest route forward, the constitutional hierarchy can remain unchanged while the practical balance starts moving beneath it. According to royal commentators, this is why any reported transfer of operational control would matter so deeply. Charles would still receive government papers, fulfill state responsibilities, and remain the symbolic center of the monarchy. William, however, could increasingly determine how royal resources were used, which engagements received priority, and how the family responded when competing demands reached the palace at the same time. That arrangement might protect continuity, but it would also create a contradiction the royal household could not conceal indefinitely. The king would hold the highest authority, while his son exercised more of the decision-making that made that authority visible. Historically, the monarchy has relied upon clearly defined mechanisms when a sovereign becomes unable to perform certain responsibilities. Councillors of state can undertake limited official duties, while a regency would involve a much more formal transfer under specific legal circumstances. Nothing publicly confirmed suggests that either process is unfolding here. Yet the speculation surrounding William appears to concern something less dramatic and potentially more influential: a practical redistribution of responsibility without a change to the crown itself. Such an arrangement could be presented as modern teamwork. It could also become a source of institutional tension if no one understood where consultation ended and command began. This may explain why Anne's reported silence carried so much weight. The Princess Royal would recognize that royal families are often most vulnerable during periods when roles change faster than titles. She has lived through the final decades of one historic reign, the difficult adjustment that followed, and the continuing effort to define what a smaller working monarchy should look like. Her concern may therefore have extended beyond Charles and William as individuals. She could have been watching the offices around them, the loyalties forming within those offices, and the danger that family members might begin responding to the transition according to personal advantage. Queen Camilla's household would have reason to preserve the dignity and priorities of the existing reign. William's advisors would naturally focus on the structure he may one day inherit. Long-serving courtiers could feel loyalty toward Charles, while younger officials might view the Prince of Wales as the more decisive figure for the monarchy's future. None of those positions would automatically be improper. The danger would appear when advice became divided according to allegiance rather than duty. If one proposal received different answers from separate royal offices, which response would senior staff follow? If William rejected a recommendation and someone appealed privately to Charles, would the king reverse his son or reinforce the new structure? And if Charles continued overruling decisions after transferring responsibility, would the arrangement carry any real meaning? Those questions could turn ordinary administration into a quiet test of power. Some observers believe William's likely instinct would be to avoid confrontation. His public approach has often emphasized measured change, collaboration, and long-term planning. Yet operational authority would demand something more immediate. He could not preserve unity by allowing every disagreement to remain unresolved. The future monarch would have to demonstrate that consultation did not mean indecision. That could require difficult choices involving people who had served Charles for years. Advisors accustomed to direct access might suddenly find their recommendations reviewed through a new channel. Household appointments could face closer scrutiny. Traditional practices might be questioned, not because William wished to reject his father's reign, but because he would be responsible for ensuring that the system functioned under greater pressure. Catherine's influence could become important precisely because she does not hold formal authority over the institution. Her role might be to help William recognize when decisiveness was necessary and when a strong response could be interpreted as a personal challenge to the king. The emotional calculation would be delicate. A son exercising power too cautiously could appear unprepared. A son using it too firmly could make his father seem displaced. Camilla would confront the same change from another direction. Her access to Charles has always given her a position that extends beyond official schedules. But if operational matters were now expected to pass through William, personal closeness to the sovereign could no longer guarantee institutional approval. It remains unconfirmed whether any direct disagreement has occurred. Still, the strategic tension is clear. The new arrangement could only succeed if everyone accepted that affection, seniority, and long-standing influence did not create separate routes around the authority Charles had reportedly chosen to delegate. Was this truly a family adjustment, or was the monarchy attempting to close the informal channels that had made coordinated leadership increasingly difficult? And the answer may have depended upon how William used the first serious test placed before him. She could support the transfer while remaining deeply critical of the secrecy surrounding it. She might believe her nephew was capable of leading, yet fear that Charles had given him responsibility without openly defending that responsibility against those who would resist it. That would leave William carrying authority on paper while still being required to prove it inside every room. And proving it could carry a personal cost. Each firm decision might reduce confusion, but it could also expose who no longer accepted the changing order. Advisors could resign. Family relationships might cool. Charles himself might discover that allowing his son to leave felt very different from watching him make choices the king would not have made. This is why the transfer, if accurate, would reveal something larger than preparation for succession. It would suggest that the monarchy was already testing a new model in which Charles remained the sovereign while William became the institution's principal force of direction. Such a model could preserve experience and introduce greater energy. It could also fail if father and son allowed separate groups to gather around them. Princess, and may have understood that danger before anyone else was willing to say it aloud. Her reported decision to break her silence was therefore unlikely to be a simple declaration of support or opposition. It may have been a warning that authority divided without honesty could damage both men. because the most important question was no longer whether William was ready to receive greater control. It was whether Charles was prepared to let that control become real when the first decision threatened someone close to him, and whether Anne would stand beside her brother or publicly defend the future king when that test finally arrived. That test would arrive the moment William's authority encountered an interest protected by the existing court. Until then, expanded responsibility could still be described as preparation, cooperation, or temporary support. But once the Prince of Wales was required to uphold a decision that disappointed someone close to Charles, the arrangement would reveal whether control had genuinely shifted or merely changed in appearance. Reports suggest the first pressure may have centered on the management of royal appointments, engagements, and household recommendations. Buckingham Palace has not confirmed the details, and no private exchange can be treated as established fact. Yet royal commentators believe that any meaningful transfer would inevitably affect Queen Camilla, whose office had long operated through direct access to the king. Under a revised structure, proposals associated with her household might be reviewed alongside the wider priorities of the monarchy. From an institutional perspective, that could create consistency. From Camilla's point of view, however, it might feel as though a personal and trusted route to the sovereign had been replaced by a system controlled by his son. The emotional danger was obvious. William could not use his new influence to settle old family tensions without damaging the legitimacy of his leadership. But neither could he avoid difficult decisions, simply because they involved his father's wife. If he allowed personal relationships to create exceptions, officials would immediately understand that the new chain of authority could be bypassed. Was this the moment when preparation became power? According to observers, the future king's most strategic response would be to make the process more transparent rather than more personal. Instead of reviewing certain requests privately or allowing separate offices to seek competing answers, he could require that significant operational recommendations be shared through one coordinated system. Such a decision would appear administrative, but its consequences would reach throughout the palace. Advisors who had previously relied upon private influence would lose their advantage. Senior staff would no longer be able to approach Charles after receiving an unwelcome answer from William. The king could remain fully informed without becoming an alternative route of appeal. That would protect father and son from being deliberately placed against one another. Yet it would also make the transfer impossible to dismiss as symbolic. The moment Charles accepted a decision he might personally have handled differently, William's authority would become real. The king would no longer be supporting his son only when their judgments aligned. He would be demonstrating that the new arrangement could survive disagreement. For Charles, that may have been the most painful stage of all. Delegation sounds orderly when discussed in principle. In practice, it means watching decisions move without waiting for one's final intervention. A revised engagement, a delayed appointment, or a reassigned responsibility might be perfectly reasonable and still feel like evidence that the royal machine had begun turning around another center. Some commentators have suggested that this is where the monarch's reaction would matter more than William's instruction. If Charles quietly reversed his son, the palace would understand that the transfer had limits. If he allowed the decision to stand, everyone would recognize that the heir now possessed more than influence. Princess Anne's reported decision to speak may have come at precisely this point. The Princess Royal's intervention, if the claims are accurate, was not necessarily aimed at Camilla or any particular advisor. It may instead have been directed toward the dangerous ambiguity surrounding Charles himself, and could support her brother's dignity while insisting that he not weaken William by granting responsibility and then rescuing others from its consequences. Her message would have been uncomfortable but necessary. Authority cannot be transferred only when its use causes no pain. Buckingham Palace has not verified any private remarks attributed to Anne. Nevertheless, her public reputation gives the interpretation weight. She has rarely been associated with decorative loyalty. Her service has been defined by practicality, discipline, and the belief that duty must remain effective even when family feeling becomes complicated. If she truly broke her silence, she may have done so because the palace was approaching a point where private discomfort threatened public coherence. That coherence could become fragile very quickly. Long-serving staff might begin choosing sides. Some could regard William's methods as modern and decisive, while others viewed them as a premature disruption of Charles's reign. A resignation, an unexplained departure, or a cancelled meeting could then become evidence of a larger internal struggle, even if the official explanation remained routine. The media would not need a confirmed dispute to build a narrative. A photograph of William receiving official papers, an increase in his public duties, or an altered palace announcement could be interpreted as proof that the king had been pushed aside. Conversely, any highly visible appearance by Charles might be presented as an attempt to reassert control. The monarchy would therefore face a communication problem without an easy solution. A detailed explanation could expose too much about the internal redistribution of work. Silence would allow others to define the change. Carefully chosen language about support, continuity, or shared responsibility might preserve constitutional accuracy while failing to satisfy the public's growing curiosity. And if the palace acknowledged William's expanded role, it would have to reassure the country that Charles had not become a monarch in name alone. This is where public symbolism could become crucial. A joint appearance by father and son would communicate more than a written statement. Charles allowing William to take the visible lead, while remaining present and engaged, could frame the development as confidence rather than surrender. William, in turn, would need to ensure that stepping forward did not look like leaving his father behind. And his presence could strengthen that message. As the king's sister and one of the most respected working royals, her visible support would suggest that the transition had not divided the family's core. Her approval would not eliminate every private concern, but it could prevent the change from being interpreted solely as a struggle between generations. Camilla's participation would be equally significant. If she appeared beside Charles while accepting William's expanded responsibilities, the public image would suggest adaptation rather than resistance. Yet observers would continue watching for smaller signs, whether her program changed, whether her household retained influence, and whether she publicly acknowledged the Prince of Wales's new position. Catherine would face the opposite challenge. She might need to increase her duties while carefully avoiding any impression that she and William were celebrating the movement of authority. Her calmness could reassure the public, but even restraint would be analyzed as evidence that the couple had been preparing for this moment longer than anyone knew. The central conflict had therefore moved beyond palace procedure. It was becoming a contest over meaning. Was Charles demonstrating foresight by empowering his heir early, or revealing that the pressures of kingship had exceeded what he could continue to manage alone? Was William protecting the current reign, or quietly beginning the next one? And was Anne's intervention an expression of family unity, or a warning that unity could no longer be taken for granted? The strongest turning point would not be a dramatic confrontation. It would be the first occasion on which Charles chose not to reclaim a decision after William had made it. In that restraint, the palace would receive its clearest instruction. The king still held the crown, but he had accepted that leadership could now move through his son without returning to him for correction. Yet even that would not settle the deeper question. Because the true meaning of Anne's silence, and her decision finally to end it, depended on whether she believed Charles was wisely preparing the monarchy's future or asking William to carry a burden that could permanently alter the relationship between them. And that is where the final part of the story becomes impossible to ignore, not in who controlled the paperwork, the schedules, or the palace offices, but in whether the crown could pass into stronger hands without making the man who still wore it feel that his own chapter had already been closed. That may be the central truth behind Princess Anne's reported intervention. Her concern was never simply whether William could manage greater responsibility, or whether Charles should retain every function associated with the sovereign. It was whether the monarchy could adjust to a new balance of leadership without turning necessity into rejection. Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed the claimed private discussions, and the exact limits of William's reported authority remain unclear. Yet the debate surrounding them reveals how dramatically the meaning of royal succession has changed. The future of the crown is no longer imagined only as a distant moment marked by mourning, proclamation, and ceremony. It may now be taking shape gradually, through shared responsibilities and a deliberate transfer of experience before any formal change in reign. That possibility gives Charles a different kind of legacy. A monarch is traditionally expected to remain at the center of royal life for as long as duty permits. But leadership can also involve recognizing when another person is better placed to manage the institution's growing demands. If Charles has chosen to give William genuine operational influence, the decision could eventually be remembered not as an admission of failure, but as an attempt to protect continuity before uncertainty became a crisis. The success of that decision, however, would depend upon whether the king truly accepted its consequences. It would not be enough to praise his son's readiness in public while quietly restricting him in private. William could not be expected to carry responsibility without the freedom to make decisions that occasionally differed from his father's instincts. Authority without independence would leave him accountable for outcomes he did not fully control, while Charles would continue bearing the strain he had supposedly tried to reduce. Anne's importance may lie in her willingness to confront that contradiction. The Princess Royal has never needed to become the most powerful person in the room to influence what happens inside it. Her authority comes from service, experience, and the absence of any obvious desire to shape the succession for personal advantage. If she supports William's expanded role, her approval could reassure those who fear that the heir is moving too quickly. If she also insists upon Charles's continued dignity, she could prevent reform from becoming a public rejection of the current reign. In that sense, Anne may represent the bridge the monarchy now requires. She understands the world Charles inherited with its emphasis on hierarchy, privacy, and endurance. She also recognizes the pressure facing William, who will be expected to lead a more concentrated royal family under relentless public examination. Her reported decision to speak would therefore carry a message to both men. The institution can evolve, but it cannot survive if adaptation is poisoned by silence, guilt, or rivalry. William's long-term challenge will be turning inherited authority into public confidence. The future king may seek a smaller and more focused monarchy, but fewer working royals would mean greater pressure upon each person who remains. Every national appearance would matter more. Every controversy would be harder to contain. Illness or absence could leave immediate gaps, while family disagreement might become impossible to conceal behind a large program of royal activity. Operational control would therefore be only the beginning. William would need to determine which causes best represent the next reign, how traditional ceremonies should be preserved, and how a modern monarchy can demonstrate relevance without becoming another branch of public relations. He would also have to decide how much of Charles's work should continue and where a new direction is necessary. Those choices would influence how history compares father and son. A decisive break could make William appear modern, but risk diminishing his father's achievements. Too much continuity could protect Charles's legacy while preventing the new leadership from establishing a clear purpose. The most difficult path would be the middle one, reforming the institution without behaving as though everything before it had failed. Catherine would become essential to that balance. Her public presence could humanize the transition and help place family continuity beside institutional change. Yet greater visibility would bring greater expectations, particularly if the public began viewing her not only as the Princess of Wales, but as the woman preparing to stand beside the next sovereign. Camilla's response could also shape how the transition is interpreted. Acceptance of William's authority would allow the current and future courts to coexist without appearing competitive. Continued resistance, even if private, could encourage narratives of division and create uncertainty over which household truly directed royal priorities. No confirmed evidence establishes such a dispute. Nevertheless, royal observers will continue examining how responsibilities are distributed, whose initiatives receive attention, and whether the king's household appears integrated with the future being organized around his son. This is why public perception may ultimately matter as much as internal structure. If people see Charles and William working together, the arrangement could appear prudent and reassuring. If their roles seem poorly defined, every routine adjustment could be interpreted as evidence of decline, ambition, or conflict. The palace must therefore explain enough to preserve trust without turning private royal management into a constant public negotiation. The image it creates will influence not only Britain, but the Commonwealth and every country reconsidering what the crown represents in modern national life. A confident transition could demonstrate that monarchy is capable of adapting before circumstances force it to do so. A confused one could strengthen the argument that inherited institutions struggle whenever human vulnerability reaches the person at their center. Perhaps the most significant consequence concerns William himself. Receiving greater authority before becoming king could give him valuable experience that previous heirs never possessed. He could enter a future reign already familiar with the weight of final decisions rather than learning under the pressure of immediate accession. But early responsibility could also consume the years he hoped to spend preparing his family gradually for the demands ahead. Power would arrive before the title, and with it the emotional cost of watching his father step back. Anne's reported message offers a way through that difficulty. William does not need to treat leadership as victory, and Charles does not need to interpret delegation as disappearance. Their roles can change without their relationship becoming a contest. The crown may remain legally with one man while its daily burden is increasingly carried by another, provided both understand that service, not pride, must define the arrangement. That may be the lasting meaning of this development. The monarchy is attempting to prepare for succession not through a single dramatic ending, but through a controlled shift in responsibility while experience can still be shared. Whether that model succeeds will depend upon trust inside the family and clarity outside it. And while Anne's intervention may have helped define where she stands, the wider royal picture remains unsettled. Was this a carefully planned evolution, or the clearest indication yet that the pressure surrounding Charles had accelerated changes the palace once expected to unfold slowly? Because as one transfer of influence begins to make sense, another question is emerging elsewhere inside the House of Windsor, and it may reveal who else is being repositioned as the monarchy quietly prepares for what comes next.